let's talk NASCAR and the Cup Series. You already started, Landon, by your statement of wanting to right the wrongs of the internet commenters. Mm-hmm. Where would you like to dive into our latest information that has been put out there via our friend Bob Pockris today, in that we can see the letters that 2311 and NASCAR exchanged? They're really good.
Post
and the charter offer. Yeah.
You know, if you're a listener and you haven't seen this, I guess where I would go is Twitter and go to Bob Pockris's, and that's where you'll find he's posted screenshots of the letters. It's basically a letter from 2311 to NASCAR, to Steve Phelps, around the time I think that NASCAR gave them their ultimatum. So this is 2311 notifying NASCAR that they weren't signing the charter agreement, and then NASCAR has a response, and then 2311 has another response to that. Very interesting, and they're very readable, right? So it's not like trying to read the complaint where it's a bunch of legal terms that you don't, understand and hard to put into context. It's very, plain English written letters, in my opinion. So they're interesting to me. I think that, obviously the entire lawsuit itself doesn't hinge on what's, the content of these letters, and there's a lot more that will be litigated, but I still stand on, first of all, the most interesting thing to me going on right now is this injunction, right? And what comes out of that. Mm-hmm. And then from that point, I've had this thought in the last couple of days that I think that NASCAR, through the last 7 years, I think that is it possible that they made a fatal mistake that opened themselves up to this? And that fatal mistake was the charters in the first place. Right? Like whether they have the, whether NASCAR is on the right side of this or not, or, 20 can change my verbiage and say whether 2311 is on the right side of this or not. Had the charters never been created, right? Had NASCAR sort of put the stop to the charters back in 2015, in that whole discussion going into 2016, would 2311 even have the case that they think they have now? Now, I know back in 2015, 2016, antitrust lawsuits were being thrown around, but I wasn't, party at any real high level. It was more just, people talking, right? It was like, oh, I've heard that there's an antitrust lawyer looking at this or whatever. But the reason I bring this all up is because back in 2015, before the charter agreement, there was no obligation to go race, right? Nope. It was a completely open field.
Yep. And you were locked into the field if you were the top 36 in points.
Yeah, you were locked in based on points, right?
Yep.
But you also didn't have like some contractual obligation with NASCAR to field a car, and
it was race by race.
Like it was
you showed up.
You show up and race, right? Did that, and maybe I might be glossing over some of the because the teams did have contracts with NASCAR back then, right? There's ownership agreements and obligations, so I don't want to gloss over the obligations that did exist, and maybe some of those in owners' opinions or an antitrust lawyer opinions, maybe those, did violate some kind of antitrust laws or something. But did NASCAR sort of walk themselves into this issue, this mess, by reaching agreements with the teams for these charters? Like, did it? That's. You don't have to answer it. Neither of us are really capable of answering the question. But
I was going to say, I don't know. Once again, we're not lawyers, but
right, that's one of my thoughts. Yeah. It's just like, here I'm just reading through all these letters and reading through, and I'm going to sound like a NASCAR operative again, but I'm listening to Denny and, and these team owners that are like, poor us, right? Like as if NASCAR has a gun to their head that they have to race, right? like as if NASCAR is forcing them to do business with them, right? Which you could maybe say, like, well, we have this charter agreement, so we have to field a car, and we have to field the car that they tell us to field, and we got to spend. They're requiring us to spend all this money, and it's a monopoly because they're stealing all the profits and making us spend all the money to race, right? Mm-hmm. And we have this contractual obligation to race, and if we don't race, we lose it all, right? And it's like with the charter agreements, I guess I could see that, what they're saying, right? But then without the charter agreements, I could also see this like, well, it's a free market. If you don't want to race, nobody's making you race. Right, but if you do want to race, here's the rules that you have to abide by.
Yep.
Right
for the injunction.
So,
go ahead.
That's I don't know. That's just my random thought experiment for this.
For the injunction, if you remember last week, I did find back in the 1970s when the IndyCar versus kart teams were going USAC versus kart and IndyCar. This was in IndyCar. We're trying to stop the kart teams from racing the Indy 500. They were granted an injunction for all those teams to race in the Indy 500. Now, not knowing some of the particulars, that doesn't mean, one of the things I think that's interesting with that whole injunction is that, from NASCAR side, it'd be like, well, you can race as an open team. Basically, anyone can just show up with the right car, pay the entry fee, so on and so forth. But being able to race under the provision of what the charter gives you, as if they had signed it with the new charter agreement, that's the interesting part of that injunction. We'll see where that goes. They did ask for a expedited discovery, by the way, and they hope to have that before the end of the year.
The teams asked for an expedited discovery, or NASCAR?
The 2311 FRM for the injunction. And it will be ruled on by a federal judge in Charlotte, North Carolina, before the end of the year. So we'll see what happens there. Cassill also said, which is the attorney for 2311 FRM, estimated the case could take 1 to 2 years if it goes to a full jury trial. That's the actual full antitrust lawsuit. So we'll see. To your earlier point, I think that has been one of the tougher things for all motorsports. This isn't just a NASCAR thing. If you look at the history of F1, of IndyCar was just, we talked about 2 weeks ago how they just put in a charter system. All these motorsport series have gone through sort of growing pains of trying to apply some form of what stick and ball sports has had. And that means, stick and ball sports all follow a very similar franchise model, right? Of between the teams and the stadiums and how the actual league is run and so on and so forth, right? Whereas motorsports has always been different because it's a bit of a governing body or a sanctioning body and maybe a media rights holder, and then there's teams, and then there's drivers, and there's always been this openness to a lot of the motorsport series, and so they've all gone through this. If you look at the history of F1, they've had a very tumultuous time over the last 3 decades, getting to where they are now, where they, the latest ownership, Liberty Media, they got to where they're basically at 50% of the revenue of the sport, and it's a pretty symbiotic relationship because they also have a cost cap, right, which has helped as well in F1. But before that, if you look back just 12 years, 15 years ago, there were still talks at times, and there was in the late 90s, early 2000s, and in the early 2010s, the teams were threatening to start their own series at times because of trying to figure this sort of stuff out. So, with the whole charter thing, I think that when they did that, it was looked at as this in between the idea of stick and ball sports and what you could apply to motorsports without it being some sort of franchise, which is a tough thing to do when you don't have stadiums and all that stuff that the teams own. So I think it's probably the natural course of business that happened. To answering your question, I have no idea, but I think understanding the history of how this came about is important, and I think it's also important to understand this isn't siloed to NASCAR. This is more of a motorsports problem than it is just a NASCAR problem. Motorsports series in general have struggled to figure out how to compensate race teams commiserate to the income of the series versus what it costs to go racing. And that has just been a problem through and through, and it may forever be a problem. And I know F1 right now is in a great spot, but without the explosion post-Drive to Survive of their revenues, I don't know if you'd be hearing all the hunky-dory, cheery stuff you hear out of F1. And that's just a fact. So we'll see where this goes. But at the end of the day, a growing pie makes it really easy like F1. For NASCAR, it's been a pretty almost stagnant pie in a lot of ways, and now it's increased. We'll see how it gets split up and that sort of thing. But
Why
are we done
is
legal
that?
talking?
Why?
What?
Like NASCAR, like motorsports is a competitive sport. The reason it's
Yep.
hard to control costs in a competitive sport is because you can't. There's never enough money, right? That's how competitive
It's a
sports are.
zero-sum game.
Right. That's how competitive businesses are. It's just there's never enough money, right? Nobody truly has a monopoly, right? Like you have to compete. No team, right? I'm talking about teams.
How dare you say that? You brought that word in, you NASCAR operative.
Well, what
This guy.
like what is it about stick and ball sports that or do they have the same? Do they ultimately they do have the same problem as racing, where it's just like
I
there's
think
never
they have the
enough
same
money?
problems. There's never enough money. I think they have the same problems. I think the only difference they have is that they don't have this technological piece that takes up 90% of the revenue. Well, no, they're not building parts and pieces in cars that are constantly becoming obsolete, right? The basis of motorsports.
Worse.
What, humans?
Worse. They have humans that they have no asset value in. Right?
Well,
that is true.
And they also have arenas and towns that want to be hold.
I'm not going to.
But that's one of the funny things
real
about
estate's real estate.
Yeah, stick and ball sports is interesting. Is like they literally can pack up their bag and move an entire team. We've seen it done overnight before with the Baltimore Colts and all of that. So it's just interesting how they can get subsidized basically through local places that want to support them and make them richer.
Okay, but all right, just to both of you, just hold up for 1 second. I was going somewhere with this. If you look at the design of a race team, right? Let's just think about a race team at a top level. Let's just say what percentage is engineering? 60%? 70%? So, on a 100-person race team, 70 of your people. So what is the roster of an NFL team? How many people are on the NFL roster, Josh? I can't remember. Is it 32?
What, for actual players?
Yeah.
53.
53. All right. So that's your big – so they would be your cars, right? So then you probably have people in the background, whatever, but are commiserate. So I'm saying is that technology for race teams is the big problem. For motorsports in general, it's always been the problem.
But
you have to
stick and ball
build race
sports have
cars.
spending caps on.
They also have
on
spending
those
caps,
things.
yes. They have
Right.
spending caps on people, yeah, and all that
And
stuff.
maybe the way they like the auditing of those spending caps is simpler because it's just contracts with players.
Possibly.
I mean, can the team spend as much money as they want on technology? Like, I don't know. Like, can the Dallas Cowboys invest in some super crazy AI simulation football field that does nothing but run simulations of football games and playbooks? I mean, maybe they already have, right? Could they spend $30 million a year on? Could they? What's stopping them from that?
They can also one of the interesting
I'm
things
just
is
laughing about it.
with the draft is those contracts for the draft are based on the selection. So if you're the first overall pick, you get the highest contract as a rookie.
Right.
And those are all predetermined. So
we're going all over the place here.
I was going to say, oh, hold on. Let's get back to shit we know because we don't know anything about any of this. My point, like, I just go one step back. To put it lightly, why motorsports series have struggled in the past is because it costs so much to compete, and it's an endless need of money. That's why it's difficult. And so, why F1 has worked is possibly because of the budget cap, but they also had a huge, massive increase in revenue via their explosion of popularity.